Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for October 20th, 2017. On today's show, we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of news, including a potential Pacific Rim crossover that could see Godzilla and King Kong come face-to-face with the mechs. We'll find out why David Fincher turned down a Star Wars movie, and if Rian Johnson will have any involvement in Star Wars Episode 9. And we'll take a look at some hilarious Geostorm reviews that might make you want to go see the movie in theaters this weekend. And we'll find out a little bit more of the Dark Tower TV series that I'm not convinced is actually going to ever happen. Joining me on today's show is Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's up?
And Chris Evangelista.
Hello.
So, guys, let's just get into it. I also forgot to mention, in the mailbag, we're going to be talking about Deceptive movie trailers and marketing. So we'll get to that after the news. But let's just get right into the news. The director of Pacific Rim 2 is out promoting the film pre-release, and he has said that the Pacific Rim crossover with Godzilla and Kong may eventually happen. Ben, what do we know?
Yes, so the Pacific Rim franchise is owned by Legendary Pictures, which is the same studio that is producing the MonsterVerse movies, which are Godzilla and King Kong and, Mothra and all of that stuff that's going on. That franchise started in 2014 with Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. It includes Kong Skull Island. It's building toward a Godzilla versus Kong movie that's coming out pretty soon. So, the director, Stephen Knight of Pacific Rim Uprising, was asked if it was possible that there could be a crossover between Pacific Rim and these legendary MonsterVerse movies. And he said, "I won't say there's an Easter egg, but there's been a lot of discussion about that possibility. Look, I think it would be fantastic to have the Pacific Rim universe join Legendary's Monster universe. It seems like a natural step. And part of that big overall plan after the third movie we've talked about is that could happen. It's always a possibility. It's by far not a certainty. It's merely theoretical at this point. But as a fan myself, I would love to see that happen." So we don't know if this is, it's certainly not official, as he says. It's just a theory, but it makes a lot of sense, especially considering the subject matter of all three of those sort of quasi-franchises. Peter, what do you think about
I just want to say,
a Pacific Rim creature wandering in and just punching King Kong in the face?
I just want to say, this is like the worst kind of news story usually when a reporter asks someone, like, do you think this would be possible? And they're like, yeah, I think it could be possible. But there is something to this because he says that they've had discussions and there's some kind of Easter egg in the movie. So it definitely seems like it's more than just completely theoretical. They've had like some kind of talks on it. I don't know what to think of this. This is kind of cool. I like kind of where we're going with this mashup movie culture, but on the other side of things, Godzilla at very least took place in modern day, and we kind of didn't have other monsters. I guess Pacific Rim takes place in the future, right? And Skull Island takes place in the past.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So is Pacific Rim the future of this monster universe? Are Godzilla and Kong like the beginning of the kaijus coming to Earth? That's kind of interesting. What do you think, Chris?
I'm sure they'll find a way to make it work, but I'm going off the first Pacific Rim, but the first Pacific Rim is so different in style to both the Godzilla and the King Kong movie we've gotten so far. Like, the Godzilla movie is very grim and dark, and King Kong was sort of dark to an extent, whereas Pacific Rim is very colorful, and it feels like it's set in a completely different universe. So I don't know. Maybe the second Pacific Rim will bridge that gap, but based on the first one, it seems like they're in completely different worlds. So it seems kind of strange to mash them together.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how they will tie this together. I know, when you're watching Kong Skull Island, it seemed like there was almost no interest from the filmmaker to tie that into the monster universe. It was kind of like thrown in there, and it didn't feel like it was part of the movie whatsoever. Kind of like how, the stuff in Batman vs. Superman felt like just like it thrown in there for Justice League. But I don't know. I think if they're going to make this MonsterVerse work, and I know I've already said this on the podcast in the past, they need to actually put some effort into making it work and making it connected, and it can't just be this half-assed thing that just comes together. Like, I think that you need to do some planning. You don't need to shove it down our throats and make it feel unorganic. But it seems like you need to have the filmmakers on board, which it doesn't seem like they have been on board until maybe Stephen DeKnight.
Yeah, and he also mentions that this theoretically would happen after the third movie, so some of that planning that you're talking about could happen in Pacific Rim 3, assuming that Pacific Rim Uprising does well enough to warrant a Pacific Rim 3. But, that could be part of those discussions that they were having is like, hey, if this does well enough and if we get a chance to do a third movie, maybe we can plant those seeds. So after the third film, when, maybe after Godzilla versus Kong, when we've reached the end of our announced slate of these movies, now we'll have an opportunity to sort of combine both of them and bring these worlds together. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
I don't want to prolong this any further, but in the Godzilla movie, Godzilla ends up being the good guy, right? And in the Kong movie, Kong ends up being a good guy. So if they mashed up all three of these into one movie, is it the Jaegers fighting Kong and Godzilla, or Kong and Godzilla on the side with the Jaegers fighting these even bigger? I don't understand how it would even work.
I think you're probably thinking more about this than anyone at Legendary at this point.
That is probably true. Moving on, rumored in the past, we've heard many directors who have supposedly met to make a Star Wars movie or have interest in a Star Wars movie. One of those directors we've heard rumors about is David Fincher. We have not gotten confirmation about him actually in a meeting until now. David Fincher is talking to the press, and he explains why he passed on directing Star Wars. Chris, you wrote this up. What do we know?
Right. So in the past, it was rumored that Fincher was on like a short list basically to direct a Star Wars film, and it was never really confirmed or denied until now, where Fincher's out there, he's doing press for Mindhunter on Netflix, and he said he talked to Kathleen Kennedy about the film, and basically what it boils down to is just the pressure. He says you'd have to really clear your head, I think. You'd have to really be sure this is what you wanted to do, because either way, it's 2 years of your life, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's a direct quote from him. So, I mean, basically, it just sounds like it boils down to he's not completely adverse to the idea, but it just seemed like so overwhelming. And you'd have to literally commit 110% that he just wasn't ready to do that.
It's interesting, I think, on two parts, because number one, Fincher seems to be interested in doing a big budget film. Like, he was trying to get, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea off the ground at Disney for a while. He was in talks for World War Z2, or he's making World War Z2. We'll get to that in a second. It's interesting that he would consider, at least, go in for the meeting for the Star Wars film. What do you guys think it is? Do you think Kathleen Kennedy wanted him for a standalone movie, or do you think this was part of the Skywalker saga that he was wanted for?
Didn't Fincher get his start in Lucasfilm in some capacity? Am I conflating him with somebody else?
No. You are there. That is the truth. He
worked for Industrial Light and Magic, I believe.
Yeah,
I think
he came up with this rig that was basically taking like a Steadicam and running through a forest and basically speeding up the footage, so that it would look like you were on a vehicle like flying through the trees and stuff like that. And he approached ILM with this idea, or from what I've heard, and they were making Return of the Jedi at the time. And I think they already had their plans for the speeder bike chase and how they were going to do it, but they were kind of like, this guy is coming up with ideas that we're coming up with. Let's hire this guy. So he got hired to work at ILM, and I think there's this famous story of maybe I'm mixing this up. Is it Michael Bay? Did Michael Bay ever work at ILM?
I think he did.
I feel like Michael Bay did storyboard for Raiders of the Lost Ark, the truck chase.
Is that true?
I think so.
Hold on, we're going to stop this, and we're going to look this up. Okay, so I was correct. I just watched an interview with David Fincher where he talked about he had this idea for that kind of a vehicle going through like a city or trees, and he went to go rent a Steadicam, and he found out that all the Steadicam rigs were rented by ILM already. So he went to his buddy at ILM and was like, do you know when they're gonna not be renting the Steadicams anymore? And he told him about his idea, and the guy and his friend Alan was like, "Who'd you hear that from?" And he was like, "What do you mean hear from?" He was like, "I'll call you back." And basically, he got a call back from Dennis Muren, who ended up offering him a job to work at ILM based on that idea, because that was something they were already doing for Return of the Jedi. But yes, Michael Bay also worked at ILM and was in the storyboard department, not doing storyboards, and he famously saw some storyboards for, I think, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And
he said that he told Steven Spielberg that he was 15 years old and said, "I thought Raiders of the Lost Ark was going to suck based on the storyboards that he saw." So that's interesting. But anyway, all of this was just to point out the fact that Fincher has a history with Lucasfilm, and I was wondering if maybe nostalgia had some sort of factor in that decision of them being like, "Hey, let's reach out to this guy who sort of got his start with us." I can't imagine that they would have thought about him for one of the saga films, but he seems like the kind of guy who would be really interesting, producing or directing one of these standalone movies. But I don't know. I guess we'll never know unless he reveals more information.
I mean, he seems like such kind of an auteur filmmaker that he wouldn't work well within the environment of a company like Marvel or Lucasfilm that has kind of a grand vision. But if he was going to work at all, I think it would be, that standalone a Star Wars story. But right now he's working on World War Z 2. Chris, he also said something about that. What do we know?
Right. So he basically just said he's working on the script right now with Dennis Kelly. And he said, "We're hoping to get a piece of material that's a reason to make a movie, not an excuse to make a movie." So, as of now, there's no release date for the film. It just seems like he's just working behind the scenes right now, hammering out that script to get it to the place it'll be where I guess he can officially commit to it, which I guess is refreshing. It shows that he doesn't want to just make a quick cash grab. He actually wants to put some thought into World War Z 2, whether it deserves it or not, I don't know.
Does anybody here actually want to see Fincher make World War Z 2?
Absolutely not.
Chris?
I love Fincher as a director. I did not like World War Z 1, but I am curious to see what, if anything, he does with the zombie genre, just because I feel like that genre has become so stale and tired that if anyone can maybe give it new life, it might be him, or at the very least he'll do something interesting with it. So
that's what I was thinking, but my thought was that was my first thought, and then I was like, oh, he's doing a sequel. The zombie stuff has already been established in the first movie, so he sort of has to theoretically, unless he just reworks the entire concept of what a zombie is for the second movie, it seems like he's going to have to sort of play by the rules that the first film established.
They can evolve. We know that. The only reason I would be interested in seeing David Fincher do a World War Z 2 is because I want to see what he can do in a bigger budget sandbox. I don't necessarily want to see him do a zombie movie or World War Z 2, but I really wish he could have got that. What was it, Captain Nemo or?
Yeah, 20,000 Leagues.
Yeah. I wish he could have got that off the ground. But next in the news, we were talking about Star Wars before. Rian Johnson directed Star Wars The Last Jedi. J.J. Abrams is coming back to direct the third in this trilogy, Star Wars Episode 9. It was initially rumored that Rian Johnson wrote scripts for not only The Last Jedi, but also Star Wars Episode 9. We had heard that was not true. now that Last Jedi is finishing up and ready to premiere later this year, and Episode 9 is developing with J.J. Abrams, people are wondering, is Rian Johnson at all involved in the development? Rian Johnson did this interview with, I think, The Hollywood Reporter, and basically he says that J.J. Abrams is doing a third movie. I'm not involved in it. They'll be writing their own story, but continuing on with what we did. I think it's a little disappointing because I feel like this Star Wars Skywalker saga is being planned almost like a TV show where a new director comes on for each episode and there's no showrunner with an overarching vision. Does that make sense?
Don't you think that Kathleen Kennedy and the Lucasfilm Story Group stand in as the showrunner in this situation?
I would think that, but then you hear Rian Johnson and I know J.J. Abrams had basically I know for a fact he could have done anything he wanted. Like, it was basically his show. He was given full control with Force Awakens. So from there, yeah, you'd think the Lucasfilm Story Group would have some kind of overseeing capacity, but Rian Johnson has said very much, and I think Pablo Hidalgo has had some interviews, and it seems like they were very hands-off and kind of like just being a resource of like, this doesn't happen in this world. Do you know what I mean? Like, we've talked about that in the past. It seems like this is very much filmmaker driven. That could be BS. It could be, Disney has been criticized for how the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been kind of run by Kevin Feige. So maybe it's just kind of, a presentation to the public in that sense, but I don't know.
But
Wouldn't you
want it to be filmmaker driven instead of somebody just coming in and sort of checking off the boxes that are already laid out for them?
I'm not sure if you're playing devil's advocate or if this is a serious question. Yes, I don't want it to be someone coming in and checking off the boxes. Number one. Number two, though, I wish that there is a grand plan so that when we watch this trilogy together, after it is completed, that it seems like it was like planned, it was one planned out vision, if that makes sense. No?
Chris, what do you think?
I mean, I'm sure they're at the very least they're exchanging notes behind it. I feel like I've read stuff like that about how at the very least, like when Rian Johnson was writing The Last Jedi, or working on it at least, he was watching The Force Awakens to get an idea of where to take the story. I mean, I'm sure it's not like a free for all. There has to be someone guiding stuff. Plus, like, I mean, as the standalone movie show, someone there is very hands on because they keep having problems behind the scenes where directors aren't exactly doing what they're being told to do, I guess. So someone behind the scenes is doing something to make sure it stays on a clear path. At least I hope so. I guess we won't know for sure until after the last film comes out, or the third film at least comes out.
I don't know. I think I'm very cynical about all this. I feel like this, the expanded universe that they're creating with Star Wars is all kind of like course correcting as the films happen and kind of reactionary and not, some grand vision of someone behind the scenes. It's kind of like, let's let these, I don't know. I guess I could see the other side. I could see like, I want to see these artists be able to create their own vision in this world. But at the same time, I kind of like the idea of, someone planning it out, and George Lucas didn't even plan it out with
right.
the original trilogy.
That's the thing is, like, that's why I'm sort of wondering why you're sort of approaching these movies more like a TV show, is because the original Star Wars trilogy, I mean, yeah, he had like loose ideas and stuff, but it seemed like those movies were very much like crafted on a one-by-one basis instead of, he didn't sit down and write the scripts for all three of them at the same time. So I don't know.
I'd like to think that George Lucas had the idea that the trilogy, when he started to make the second film, was going to be about the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader. And I feel like, you know what, it could still be that with this, because, J.J. Abrams did the first part of this trilogy, and he had plans, and he could fulfill those plans. So maybe it is a bad example to say that you need some oversight outside of the filmmaker. If the filmmaker is doing the first part and the end part, he can fulfill the things that he wanted to do.
Right. Yeah.
Moving on, a film coming out this weekend was not screened for the press. It's called Geostorm, and it is I guess like a classic 1990s disaster film. Ben, you wrote up a list of some of the funniest review quotes. These reviewers went to the theater, paid their own money to see this film and get reviews up for the movie-going public. And it's some of the most hilarious stuff. Makes me want to see the film. Can you give us some of the best?
Yes, just a brief taste. Screen Crush's Matt Singer, who actually recommends that you don't watch this movie, says, Geostorm is so punishingly bad it makes Independence Day Resurgence look like last year at Marion bad. Chris Bumbray from Joe Blow says, it's such a mess that you wonder how such a huge gamble could go so wrong. Yet for all its faults, Geostorm is quite wonderful in its awfulness. Were this an actual spoof, it would be nowhere near as funny as it is. There are a couple really funny parts here. Let's see. Matt Goldberg at Collider says, you know the scene in Day After Tomorrow where Jake Gyllenhaal outruns weather? Director Dean Devlin must have watched that scene and thought to himself, what if that, but as an entire movie? Every set piece in Geostorm is just people outrunning weather. And then I think my favorite one is from Luke Buckmaster at an Australian outlet called Daily Review. He said, to appreciate this film, which I suppose can be rationalized in the context of a guilty pleasure, one needs to be on the same page as it, which is to say somewhere semi-illiterate. So there's a lot of great stuff here, and it definitely seems like this is one of those so bad it's good movies where if you have a couple drinks beforehand and go into this movie with knowing what you're getting yourself into, that you could definitely have a lot of fun with it.
Now, are either of you actually planning on seeing this film?
I mean, even after all of these quotes that sort of make me a little bit curious, I think I would rather do anything else. So probably not.
How about you, Chris?
I'm considering it. I'm mulling it over. I have not reached a decision yet, but I'm leaning more towards yes than no.
I want to see it, but there's so many good films I have not seen in theaters. I haven't seen Mother yet. I haven't seen The Florida Project. And I have this Movie Pass card that's burning a hole in my pocket, and I'm not, I haven't gotten my $10 worth this month yet, which is sad. But does it deserve to be used on a good movie, or does it deserve to be used on Geostorm is the question. I don't know. Moving on. Chris, you're a huge fan of Stephen King, as we've talked about in the past, and you were not a huge fan of The Dark Tower. The Dark Tower TV series is still supposedly happening, but now we know it's a complete reboot already? What do we know?
Yes. Yeah, so Stephen King did an interview with Vulture, basically, where he said, first and foremost, he said he thought that Akiva Goldsman, who wrote the script, did a pretty good job whittling down, a very complex mythology into one film. I don't really agree with him there, but I mean, if he wants to believe that, that's fine. And but basically he says in the interview that the TV series they're developing now is going to literally be a complete reboot of everything. So it won't tie into the movies at all. So I guess it's like a fresh start. I still have my doubts they're even making this TV show. They can keep claiming they're making it as much as they want, but I don't think I'm going to believe it exists until I start seeing trailers for it, because it just seems so unlikely. I mean, at the same time, The Dark Tower does have a huge following. The books, have a huge following, so I could see them really wanting to get this right, but as of now, I'm really doubtful that's going to happen.
What do you think the chances are?
I don't know what the Vegas odds are, but
what are the Atlantic City odds?
I'm gonna say it's like right now it's slim to none. I mean, stranger things have happened, but right now it just seems so unlikely. Again, at the same time, Stephen King is really big right now. I mean, it was a huge box office hit, so I could see them, like behind the scenes, the producers saying, "Look, here's our proof that we can make this work. We just have to get it right." So, I mean, maybe it does have a better chance than I'm giving it.
Okay, let's get to the mailbag because we're running out of time. Jim from Chicago writes in that he is enjoying our discussions on trailers, spoilers, and how the movie-going community see movies, and wanted to ask you guys' opinion on deceptive trailers or bait-and-switch trailers. He says, when I was younger and the film Lord of War with Nicolas Cage and Jared Leto was coming out, the trailers made it seem as though the movie was an action comedy. And while there were moments of levity in the film due to the absurdity and extreme nature of being gun runners, the actual opening of the film was a sequence that followed the creation of a bullet all the way to the point where it was used to kill someone, which, by the way, was an awesome sequence. But getting back to his email, and was very effective at setting the tone for the rest of the movie. I did end up enjoying the movie quite a bit, but it always stood out as a movie I was basically tricked into seeing. Have any of you guys experienced this as well as with other films? Can't wait to hear your stories. Keep up the great work. Thank you, Jim from Chicago. You can submit your questions by sending them to peter@slashfilm.com. Leave your general geographic location when sending an email so we can mention on the air. Okay, guys. Chris, have you ever been tricked into seeing a movie based on deceptive marketing?
I mean, I don't know if I'd say I've been tricked, but I remember specifically the trailer for Where the Wild Things Are, the Spike Jonze film. It made it look like this very, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked like a completely different movie than what I got. And I'm happy with the finished film, but the trailer looked like this sort of whimsical, cheerful sort of film. And the movie itself is very like existential and dark and kind of depressing, which I'm fine with, but that was not how it was sold at all. Like the trailer looked like this cute indie comedy. It had like an Arcade Fire song playing over it, and it just looked like this charming Jim Henson film, and that's not what the final film was at all. I mean, like I wouldn't say I was tricked into seeing it, but I was expecting something completely different than what I got.
And I know you're a big fan of Crimson Peak. Angie Hahn in 2015 wrote an article for slashfilm.com that had the headline, "Turns out Crimson Peak is actually a gothic romance. 15 movies with misleading trailers." And she used, obviously, the marketing for Crimson Peak as an example here, which was mismarketed. But you're a big fan of this. Could you talk a little bit about the marketing on Crimson Peak?
Right. So the Crimson Peak trailers made it look like a straight up horror film. It used the music from Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula over the trailer, and it played up. There's a thing in Crimson Peak where the soil is red and it looks like blood, and they kept using a lot of shots of that in the trailer to make it look like it was blood. And Guillermo del Toro, he kept saying, this movie is not a horror movie. He kept saying, the marketing is misleading. At the same time, I kind of feel like he protested a little too much, because even though the film isn't a straightforward horror movie, it has a lot of horror elements in it. So I've always felt like people who've complained that movie wasn't really a horror movie are sort of being disingenuous, because I kind of think it really is a horror movie. It's not a typical horror movie, but it's horror themed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think the studio was marketing it not just in the trailers, but I remember I did a Crimson Peak haunted maze at Universal Halloween Horror Nights that year that film came out, which is weird because, the movie isn't really a horror movie. Movies I can think of, it's really weird because I can only really think of more recent movies. One that I think was more recently is Passengers, which I think was marketed as something it wasn't. They were hiding that twist. We've talked about that in another podcast. And even like the tagline for the movie was, quote, "Nothing happens by accident." Which is actually, the whole movie is set in motion by an accident in the film's first minutes, which is completely wrong. Drive, I think, was marketing as a Fast and the Furious movie. And I think that got a lot of people that probably weren't going to see that movie into theaters to see it. I remember Iron Man 3 was marketed kind of like a darker Marvel story with the Mandarin as the villain, and we know what happens with the Mandarin, and it's more of a Shane Black comedy than a darker tale. Those are the ones that come to mind for me. Before I go to bed, I just want to say that, like, I think it's a tough thing, because if you're tricked into seeing a movie that you end up liking, it's not a problem. Right? Because you ended up liking the movie. If, like, you know, there's tons of film trailers, like, you know, you look at Rogue One, half the footage in the trailers for Rogue One were not in the movie, and you can consider them deceptive. But generally people like that movie, so generally people didn't have a problem with the marketing of the movie, even though they wanted to know what the original cut was. And I think, you know, we were talking about Star Wars Last Jedi and those trailers, and we think that there's some kind of clever editing there. It'll be interesting to see what people think of that after they see the movie, if it is actually what we speculate it might be. Ben, do you have any examples of this or any thoughts?
Sort of what you're just talking about, where the experiences that I've had have been more like footage that didn't make it into the final cut that was used prominently in the marketing. And I think I may have told this story before in this podcast, so I apologize if I have. But the biggest example that I can remember where I got the most angry about it was I went to go see the Jason Statham movie, The Transporter, based solely on this sequence from the trailer in which Statham is standing in a kitchen and the bad guys launch a rocket launcher missile straight through his kitchen window. He deflects it with a silver platter into his open oven, and the whole thing explodes. And I was like, oh my God, I have to see this movie immediately. And that scene ended up being cut out of the final film. And I was so, like, distraught about that when I was, 14 when that movie came out, or whatever it was. But as far as, like, trailers that are, I guess there's a difference between that and then trailers themselves sort of being cut in a deceptive way to give you a different idea of what the movie is. And I think Angie's piece is really good. That's where I got a lot of these ideas. Catfish, if you remember that movie, it definitely made it seem more dangerous and dramatic,
almost like a horror thriller.
Yeah, definitely. And then the actual movie, which I ended up liking, and I like that movie a lot, but it's not what the trailer makes it seem to be. Magic Mike is another good example where that one seems way more sort of like a superfluous, fun kind of movie where you go see a bunch of male dancers and, like, that's all the movie is. But it's actually, that film is like a pretty serious exploration of, like Channing Tatum's character, just a working guy, and, like, it just happens to be that's the business that he's in. It's not necessarily as fun as the trailer makes it seem to be. And then Spring Breakers is the other example where it's like that movie is marketed to be sort of like it's weird because that film is like a parody of the movies and TV shows that the trailer claims this very movie is. So that's a strange thing, because it's hard to sell the tone, a complex tone like that in a trailer. And maybe if I understand why they do these things. That's not going to be something that's going to appeal to a large audience, but it ends up being a pretty good movie. So I think you might have a lot of people walking out of it being mad, and that's where, like, cinema scores come in, with movies getting bad cinema score ratings. It has everything to do with the marketing and people feeling like they were lied to. But yeah, those are sort of three of the biggest examples I can think of.
Yeah. The thing is, a lot of these trailers and a lot of these companies, these studios that they put together these movies, they'll show them to test screening audiences, and the test screening audiences, in addition to writing all these different things on this slip of paper after the movie and doing this kind of discussion, they'll rate, like, the favorite parts of the movie, and then when they go to edit a trailer, they'll often try to put those parts or make it the best of what people liked of the movie. And I think sometimes that becomes like Suicide Squad, Suicide Squad, I think, is a good example of this, where the trailers were cut into be kind of like this. The music was cool and it was bright and whatever, and that's not what the movie was at all. The movie that David Ayer did, which is like every other movie he did, is kind of dark and whatnot. And then so many people were in love with the trailers that Warner Brothers supposedly like had the trailer editors recut the movie, and there was reshoots and whatnot to basically make the movie more like the trailers that everybody had fallen in love with, and the end result was kind of a mess. So I think that's probably the only example I can think of off the top of my head that is like the negative effect of mismarketed trailers. Do you guys have any other negatives where like you were actually very disappointed?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Chris, you have anything?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think Suicide Squad is that's a good example to end on.
Yeah. A terrible example then.
But if you guys out there have any examples of this, that you actually were excited to see a movie based on the trailers and you went and saw it and were extremely disappointed. Oh, by the way, another one I can think of. This isn't one I was disappointed in, but when I was much younger and the trailers for Scream came on, I think they were, I'm not 100% sure of this because this is my memory of it, and I haven't really watched the trailers for Scream in, 2 decades or something. But I think the trailers were highly marketed on Drew Barrymore being the star of the movie.
Yeah, that one made Angie's list as well.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
And as you know, Drew Barrymore is not the star of the movie. So I'm not going to say that I was disappointed by that, because I ended up loving that when that came out, that film, and that was such a, I think. Now it's been done to death, but back then I feel like that was a clever way to market and start the film. But yes, so if you guys have any that you were tricked into seeing, you feel completely betrayed, send us the examples of peter@slashfilm.com. We'll try to mention them on our podcast on Monday. Leave your name and general geographic location. Where can we find more of your work online, Chris?
I'm at slashfilm.com, and I'm on Twitter, Evangelista413.
Ben, where can we find more of you?
I'm also at Slash Film, and you can find me on Twitter at Ben Pears.
I'm on Slash Film. All the articles you hear today are on slashfilm.com. You can find me on Twitter at Slash Film. You can follow this podcast on Slash Film on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, all the popular podcast apps. Go to iTunes, give us a rating, give us a review. That always helps us out. Tell your friends. Go on Twitter. Go on Facebook. Spread the word on this podcast. It is growing at a good rate, and I appreciate all of you for listening. We will see you on Monday.